Hello, everyone. Welcome again, I think, to many of you for this exciting week that we've had here at the Kleinman Center. For those of you who are unable to attend the event earlier in the week honoring Nicholas Stern, that is now available, the recording, on the website for free viewing. So I welcome anybody who wants to kind of have a look at that, either having seen it once and wanting to see it again, or having missed it. Here's your chance. But the week continues with today's session, a wonderful discussion on probably, for my money, the most important series of open and largely by many important interests, unexamined questions in the field of climate policy, excuse me, and energy policy. So it's extremely timely. And in addition to the people in the room, gathered in the room today, we have a very large global audience joining us online. Welcome. And the Q&A will slightly favor those in the audience who raise their hand with a question, but we'll also be monitoring the questions as they come in. So I encourage those of you who are joining us virtually to send your questions in as they arise. And we will moderate those and make sure that we get as many of them into the conversation as possible. So please, we have a whole team here ready to receive and organize your questions. So please send those in. Very briefly, the subject of net zero has kind of swept like wildfire through the policy world. And as often is the case with interesting ideas, deceptively simple ideas, that are very quickly embraced, there's a lot of skipped steps and a lot of considerations to be made about them. It really raises red flags for thoughtful scholars like our guest today. Net zero, can sound to, for example, economists as something that's going to be beautifully self-implementing. It can sound to governments like something that satisfies a longing for single action bias and, wow, we've got our net zero policy, we can step back and relax. It can sound to very powerful commercial and industrial interests like something that is very amenable to strategic representation and can provide camouflage for things that the policy itself does not intend. Each of these kinds of dynamics has in common the requirement for thoughtful governance, something that we are blessed to have one discipline that makes that a primary subject of study and concern in politics and political science. And we're very fortunate today to have a scholar whose work, in our Quaker phrase, is equal to the best in the world. Thomas Hale spent his undergraduate days at Princeton in the School of Public and International Affairs. Probably still, but certainly during my time there, was the only selective major on campus. And therefore, as you might expect at Princeton, a large number of students majored in it only because it was the only selective major on campus. Spent time getting his first graduate degree at the London School of Economics, which again has figured prominently in this wonderful week of activities, and then returned to Princeton to the politics department for his PhD, and is now an associate professor of public policy at the Oxford School of Policy, and joins us here for the whole week, although we're coming to the end of that week. He has been, in addition to this particular expertise, I would just share that he has been this wonderful, unplanned addition to, frankly, the calendaring gods gave to us, addition to many of the events this week, and has added to our conversations in a very nice way. So it's a real privilege to welcome to the podium Thomas Hale for his remarks. Tom will speak for, what did we say? 30-ish minutes. Then we'll open it up to some Q&A. Have your questions ready, because if you don't ask them, I will.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all for joining us today. And as we get the slides set up, let me just say how nice it is to be here at Penn at the Kleinman Center in such a beautiful space. I had no idea that energy policy could be so beautiful. So what a nice revelation. As Mark said, I'd like to speak today about governing net zero. And the topic, I think, is one of really pressing urgency, just as, of course, the pathway of getting to net zero is a pressing urgency, because things need to happen very quickly. And the slightly good news is that at some level, they have happened very quickly. This idea of net zero has become really an organizing principle at a speed and now at a scale, as I'll talk about, that's really, gives us a little bit of hope, I should think, in how quickly human systems overall can change and kind of pivot to things. But as Mark said, a lot of steps need to happen. And it'd be surprising if the single biggest economic, and I would argue governance transformation in human history, getting carbon out of our energy systems, getting to net zero, would happen without a kind of detailed, complex process. So of course, it's not going to be easy. And that's why we need to mobilize the systems that human societies use to figure out tough questions, i.e. our political institutions and our governance systems to try to think them through. So that's what I want to talk about today, where we are and where we could try to get to a bit more quickly on that trajectory. What I cover is 4 quick points. First, a little bit of what is net zero and why it might need to be governed. 2, to say a bit more about this rapid turn to make this idea kind of not just an academic scientific concept, but actually as organizing principle. And the heart of what I want to say is really on the governance ecosystem that's evolved around this term, this concept, and importantly, what we can do to improve it. Because I think that is, to my mind, the rate limiting step that we face really in the transition in many ways. So that's a little outline of where we're going. I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. First, what do we mean by net zero? So many of you will be deeply familiar with this idea. Some of you might be coming to it from a sense of having read about it in the paper, but not really having it seen and defined. But I think it really at heart means just this, your little moment of midday zen in the academic schedule. So breathe in, breathe out. That's basically net zero, right? A balance between sources and sinks in the atmosphere where carbon's coming out of things like us and into things like trees. And that's the balance we're trying to strike so we can make no further warming of the planet. So the IPCC has given us a very nice, clear global definition about when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are balanced by anthropogenic removals over a specified period, then we have net zero. Simple, great. I think we're all clear on that point. The hard part, though, is how you downscale this global scientific atmosphere level idea into what a city should do, what a business should do, what a country should do, right? This is not, I would argue, a clear scientific question. And so what do we mean by that? Well, one stab at a definition of what a net zero entity, if you will, means, as opposed to a net zero world, net zero atmosphere, is given by the UN's Race to Zero campaign, which I'll say more about in a minute. But it's a lot more complicated, basically, than the previous definition, right? It says, an actor reduces its emissions following science-based pathways, with any remaining greenhouse gas emissions attributable to that actor being fully neutralized by like-for-like removals, e.g. permanent removals for fossil carbon emissions, exclusively claimed by that actor, either within the value chain or through purchase of valid offset credits. So there's about 20 terms in that definition that now need their own definitions, right? And so it's not easy. And there's lots of contestation around what that means and how it should work. And that's why this question of governance, I think, is so important. So you will have seen this graph before, a little small font maybe, but you'll be familiar with this sharp shape. Net zero means the point in time where we get the global emissions down to the point where sources and sinks are balancing. Again, it's over time. So we need to think about the cumulative emissions, which is the area under this curve as the key thing driving warming. But just to note, we talk about net zero as a sort of a point in time, but really what we mean by that is this period of time, this pathway. And so we shouldn't think about net zero as like a thing you do, and then it's like the moment is achieved. It's a whole process and a whole pathway. And of course, this is another graph where you won't be able to see the things. This comes from our friends at the International Energy Agency, who have outlined one quite influential scenario of what that could look like in terms of what do you do with coal? What do you do with oil? What do you do with transport? What do you do with agriculture? How do all these different systems need to change? And there'll be different versions of this, but basically everything needs to change. And in any scenario you look at, it's a big transformation. So I think that's all pretty clear. We know the what pretty well. We need to reduce emissions, even though there's a lot of differences and important things and questions to answer around exactly which emissions get reduced most first, and prioritization and all of that is good to discuss. Reduce emissions at residual levels, restore and maintain our sinks, build up removals. Those are the basic whats. But the how is really difficult, right? The how has a lot of different tools. What different technologies might we use? What different policy tools might we use? What different behavioral pieces and changes might be necessary? And then a lot of who does what? What should different countries do? What, should the United States get to net zero by 2050, which is when the IEA says it should? Or should it try to get there a bit sooner? Because it, after all, has contributed more historically than some, say, smaller countries that might still be in the process of development. Question. And then, of course, a lot of questions in politics around how do you get resources allocated, and who does what, and who wins and loses, and ultimately, what version of a net zero world do we want as a society? And that's not a question that scientists can answer. It's something that we have to answer as a collective human society. That's what politics is. And the process that we do that can come out better or worse. And so that's why I think it's exciting to talk about this at the Kleinman Center, because it necessarily has to be an interdisciplinary discussion. And it's one that I think has been, like many things in the climate space or even in the science space more broadly, where we're seeing now rapid evolution to the tools of social science, amongst others, as important pieces of that. So that's the what we understand net zero to be. And I think once you accept it's like this massive transformation of society that has a lot of trade-offs and questions, then of course you want to think about it in this broader governance sort of need emerges. But now I want to switch gears and talk about how quickly this idea has come to be at the center of our policy efforts, the rise of net zero as a concept. And if you look back into the scientific literature, you found the term being used mostly around sort of 2009, 2010, when scientists were really focusing on the cumulative carbon budget as the thing we want to try to control to achieve our climate goals. And that got picked up into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC's assessment report in the early part of last decade, which basically says stopping climate change requires getting to some sort of net zero goal, net zero outcome. And that was encouragingly picked up really strongly by vulnerable countries, especially the small island states, and activist groups in 2015 during the negotiations of the Paris Agreement, when those entities really pushed for what was a pretty radical idea at the time, that we shouldn't just reduce emissions, as Nick Stern was saying this week, by 80 or 90%, but actually zero has to be the target, or net zero. And that was challenging for the powerful countries in Paris, the large emitters who were not ready to get there. But because of some smart campaigning and tactics and negotiations, they managed to get at least Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement in there, which says there should be a balance between sources and sinks in the second half of this century. And so that was like a nice little hook in the legal framework. And then you saw something really interesting happen, where this kind of long-term target was adopted by a whole different range of actors in their own national legislation, and indeed in other places, like in city targets and business targets. And actually the first kind of country to move in a big way here was Sweden, which in 2016 adopted the world's first net zero law. And so it's just, the kind of Swedens of the world, the kind of really progressive, we're doing the right thing kind of places that we're mobilizing on at the time. And then a real sea change came in 2018, when the IPCC released its special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which showed pretty definitively, that graph I showed you before came from that report, that to get the goals of the Paris Agreement, to have even a half and half chance of maintaining the 1.5 goal, we'd have to get to net zero by 2050, in just 3 short decades. And so that really touched a nerve, and I don't think, and maybe I'm curious what you guys think, I don't know of any other scientific report that's gotten so much attention so quickly and really kind of touched this vein in people's thinking. So that led to this huge surge of net zero targets from countries, but also from other kinds of actors. In Oxford, we've created a project to try to track those net zero targets as a collaboration with our colleagues at the New Climate Institute, at the Data Driven Lab at UNC, and a group called the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. And what we do is we look at all the countries in the world, all the cities, over 500,000 people, of which there's about 1,200 cities, all the states, regions, provinces that are in the top 25 emitting countries, so that's about 800 entities, and all of the companies in the Forbes Global 2000, which is all the largest publicly listed companies in the world. We say, do they have a net zero target? And if so, what does that include? And if you add that all up, you see net zero has gone from kind of a fringe idea in the scientific literature to kind of pushed by activists to a dominant framework in just basically less than a decade. So if you look at their website today, you can see something like 90% of emissions, nearly 90% of GDP, 85% of world population are covered by some kind of net zero target. And that's pretty striking. And I think some grounds for some hope that we're able to kind of adopt things quite quickly. Now you're probably already thinking, what does that mean? Well, how can it be 90%? Can it actually be robust? And there's lots of examples you can probably think of where you're being a little bit less than convinced by some of the net zero claims you might have seen. This is one of my favorite ones. This is the website of the Oil Sands Pathway to Net Zero Coalition, which is a project of oil sand producers in Canada. And I don't want to disparage this initiative too much, but basically their definition of what net zero means is probably not what you would expect it to be. So, and yet they're saying this is what we're doing. And this is obviously one kind of extreme example, but there's a ton of these, right? I was drinking some milk the other day, and the milk carton said that the milk was carbon positive, which I thought probably is true, but maybe you don't think that means, that doesn't mean what you think it means, maybe. But all these kind of claims are out there. And I think it's really true, something that Laurence Toubiana, the French ambassador who negotiated the Paris Agreement in 2015, she said at COP26 a few months ago, greenwashing is really like the new kind of denialism. It's a more subtle, insidious form of resisting sort of the right kinds and the needed kinds of action on mitigation by misinformation and by confusing things in a way that actually holds back progress, right? And there's a lot of, that 90% is certainly not all greenwashing, but some percentage of it is. And the worry is that if you greenwash too much, you lose the ability to know A, what's going on, B, how to sort the good from the bad. So can we try to dig into that? Now, we've seen a lot of criticism of net zero as a concept from civil society and from scientists and from others, really focused on two different vectors of criticism. One, this idea that long-term pledges are not that meaningful, when what we really need is, of course, short-term action. So again, remember that point in time, 2050, is not the thing that net zero should mean, right? Net zero should mean the whole pathway starting today, or better yesterday, but today, second best option with pretty drastic emissions reductions. And if you talk about only net zero, maybe you're emphasizing the outcome in the distant future. And of course, the net part of net zero has generated a lot of controversy because there's a worry that offsetting other kinds of sinks and removals might create a moral hazard problem, might somehow delay or even substitute for that radical fall in emissions that we know we need. And so we've seen that from Greta Thunberg and many others who have made these kinds of claims. And my worry is that that's incredibly true and right. And if that's the way we see the problem of net zero, then all of that progress of people making claims will fall apart and actually not move us the dial forward, because it will be lose meaning and value. And so what we try to do in this project is think through and look a bit more carefully, empirically, which targets are robust and which aren't, and what do we find? And can we try to track that over time and try to hopefully see changes in that over time? So trying not just to count the number of pledges, but to qualify them in some way. Here's a graph showing you the status of different national targets. Again, only the countries here. Looking at the percentage of global GHGs that are covered by different kinds of pledges. So again, 10% in law, that's good. That's the Swedens of the world. Think about the UK, Canada has a recent net zero law. Those we think are quite robust. A number of more are in policy documents of some kind. It's kind of a vague term, but you might think about this as a regulatory proposal or perhaps a strategy that the government puts out. We would categorize the US's long-term goal in this frame. There's quite a number, 20% of GHGs globally, that are in some kind of more soft declaration, which is just kind of an announcement at a conference or something like that. And then quite a few that are still quite a few who have only kind of proposed or in discussion or no target whatsoever. And a tiny fraction of countries by GHGs that actually said they've achieved net zero already, which we can dig into more deeply. But so, a lot of variation there. Also a lot of variation in the planning of the sinks part, the removals part, the offsetting part. So this is 4 graphs showing you countries regions, cities, and companies. And it's looking at the percentage of different metrics. So for countries, it's GHGs, for regions, population, cities, population, companies, revenue. So basically, it's like how much substantively of this actor group is covered by different categories. And as you can see, the biggest color here is the gray color, which means we don't know because they don't say what they're going to do about offsetting. So a huge number of net zero plans haven't really talked very clearly about what they're actually going to be doing in terms of getting to that outcome. Maybe that's okay as a first step, like maybe you haven't figured it all out yet. But if you want to assess the robustness of something, you kind of need to know, is it going to be do nothing till 2049 and then do a whole lot of tree planting, or is it going to be something different? And we need to know. So, especially the companies have been maybe the best at, and it's only about half of them that have provided any kind of information, but of those, many have said they're going to use offsetting, but not set any conditions on that, or not said what offsets they might use, or what processes they might use, or would there be any criteria for the offsetting, right? So it's just kind of ambiguous. It makes it very hard to assess. Also with companies, a lot of questions around what's covered in their emissions reductions pledges. Is it just their immediate direct emissions, or is it everything throughout their value chain, the products they sell, the inputs they buy, the so-called scope 3 emissions? As you can see, even some companies that have net zero targets don't include, this is the red, all of their scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is like kind of an obvious thing to include. So that's already a little bit problematic. But then on scope 3 emissions, you see only about 35% have a kind of target that of the companies that have net zero targets, only about 35% have a kind of full coverage as we would understand it of scope 3. So a lot of questions there as well. So if you look at the snapshot of robustness, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that's a really important caveat to the rise of net zero narrative. But there's also an interesting process of change. So if you look at countries again only, that have 90% of GDP covered now, that was 66% just 12 months ago, right? So it's changing very quickly. If you look at even the, are those before 2050, what the IPCC says we need to get to, it was 30% a year ago, half of countries by GDP now. In law, again, this is 18% of GDP. Remember, it's 10% of emissions. In the other graph, this is 18% of GDP. So, an increase of a factor of 3 over 12 months. And if you look at what we kind of look as a package of minimum robustness, you can see about a quarter of those of GDP is covered by such targets. Again, up quite a bit over a year ago. So those aren't big numbers, 25%, half, 18%, but they're growing very quickly, or have grown very quickly in the last 12 months. And the question is, how do we really keep them growing at that speed? Because that's what we need to get to going forward. But what do I mean by that minimum robustness criteria? So we kind of drew our evaluation of that from the UN's Race to Zero campaign, which is this effort by the UN to mobilize net zero targets from cities and businesses and regions, subnational and non-state actors. The UN, in its wisdom, because it's operated and controlled by governments, hasn't decided to actually evaluate governments' decisions on these things. That would be too much. So they're looking at the other actors, but it's still a useful starting point. And there's some basic stuff they need to do. They need to have a pledge that's for net zero. They need to have a plan for achieving it. They need to kind of take some actual steps to proceed on that plan. They need to publish the outputs of that. Those are sort of procedural. And then on the substantive side, net zero targets need to have a scope that covers all of their emissions, have an appropriate use of sinks and credits so that they're not kind of doing no reductions and only doing sinks and credits, and to consider equity in some way. That's what the UN says net zero targets should aim for. And so we kind of tried to use those as the basis for our minimum standard in this analysis. Obviously, those are like high level principles. And again, the devil is how you operationalize the details on them. But I think if you step back and just look at the overall, one other thing to say on this is an interesting process that actually tomorrow on Earth Day, you will have a chance to feed into the UN's process on what they're thinking the Race to Zero criteria should be, what minimum standards for net zero targets should be, because they're having an open consultation at, I guess it'll be 8 o'clock Pennsylvania time tomorrow morning, but you can register on the website and have your say in what you think that should look like. So we're seeing a lot of effort now to think about what makes net zero robust. And that's needed because of the difficulties and imperfections in many of the targets we see. And so I think we're really in this critical moment where governance is going to be the tool we're going to need much more of in the years to come. We're in this kind of Wild West moment where there's no system. Is everyone can say whatever they want, do whatever they want. There's no way to, it's very difficult to separate the real leaders from the laggards. And so we have this risk of that generating a backlash to sort of people rejecting this whole idea because it's greenwash, and maybe throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So to avoid that, I think we need to have a better governance system. Let me then turn and say what that looks like today. So why govern net zero? Well, governance is a term like maybe net zero perhaps, which is useful because it's so vague and you can mean a lot of different things by it. So that's why political scientists and lawyers and people who think about governance questions love it because it's broad. But basically what I mean is systems to set rules, to create incentives, to make sure that people do follow the rules, to monitor and hold people accountable, and to basically ensure consistency with broader social goals, because all those issues I mentioned before about it's not just getting the pathway to emissions down, it's about how we do that to build the world we actually want to live in, like the just transition with equity, all these political questions that are only resolved through a political process. And if you look around the world today, we're basically doing that in 4 different ways. So it's not clean. It's not like we have a system at the UN where we can go and say, okay, Congress of Peoples of the world, we come together and now we decide collectively this is the way it's going to be. It's a lot messier than that. It's a complex governance ecosystem with some formal parts, some informal parts, some public parts, some private parts. And so we need to kind of wrap our heads around that whole complicated picture in order to understand what's going on. And there are 4 quick pieces I'd like to walk through. Each has their strengths and their weaknesses. So the first one is one that you probably have heard a lot about. There are lots of voluntary initiatives which sign up businesses and cities and entities to net zero targets. And things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative for companies is probably the biggest one. But there's tons of things like C40, Coalition of Megacities, Under 2 Coalition, a group of states and regions and provinces, all of which are trying to get these entities to sign up to net zero standards, and also helping them kind of do it in what they consider to be a robust way and to kind of monitor and ensure that they're doing it. And these can be really great tools. They're very fast, they can experiment, they can get the leaders kind of moving forward quickly, they can help those leaders define what good looks like and learn from each other, and therefore help kind of push forward that frontier of best practice. But obviously it's all voluntary, right? So no one's making you go up there. You might face some reputational pressure or some pressure from, say, shareholders or citizens or others to do it. But ultimately, if you don't want to do it, no one's going to make you do it. So it can have some difficulty in getting the hard to reach actors involved. And if you look around the world today, you'll see it's pretty sharply limited in geographic scope. If you look at all these networks, and indeed, we try to track them in our research, it's not a lot of representation from many parts of the world, because the nature of these things are often run by sort of Western NGOs who have that sort of culture around them. And so they have a little bit of a scope condition on them as well. But they're doing some really interesting work. I put some good examples up here, what I consider good examples. There's lots of bad examples too. So there's no guarantee of quality here, right? There's some high variation, but some of them are doing interesting things. That's a private voluntary solution. On top of that, there's a second layer, which I would call orchestration. And it's called in the international relations literature orchestration. And we've particularly seen an emphasis on these big campaigns from the UN to orchestrate all this voluntary stuff that I was mentioning before. And these can be really powerful because they can help, kind of like a conductor does, steer the musicians toward a common rhythm and melody and set of outputs. So if you imagine the voluntary landscape is sort of like, I don't know, some sort of very experimental jazz where everyone's kind of going off in their own direction. And then the orchestration comes in to try to bring things into a common framework. And this is going to help because it's a little bit less voluntary, right? Because it's about steering, but it's still voluntary, right? It's not going to be, the UN doesn't have like a police force that's going to go arrest you if you don't do this. But it can make certain things more legitimate, certain things less legitimate, which then amplifies those reputational pressures, maybe the pressure from shareholders, stakeholders, et cetera. And it helps to consolidate the frontier of best practice, where if these different experimental groups are doing different things, kind of take a considered view and bring it all together. And again, this I keep mentioning this Race to Zero campaign because it's really kind of big effort in this space. And it's quite different, in my view, from previous efforts to build private governance solutions and these kind of public-private hybrid things around sustainability issues. If you think about forestry or fisheries or other kinds of global environmental dilemmas, there's a lot of private governance there. Things like the Forest Stewardship Council, you might have seen a little label on wood products or paper products you buy, like Marine Stewardship Council, you see those kinds of labels as well. That's great, but it's never had a kind of a global heft because it's only captured like about 10% of the market. This is really a different scale. The Race to Zero is capturing something like 25% of global GDP in terms of the cities and regions that's part of it. I'm zooming in this slide on the financial part of it, which is called rather inelegantly the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but that's a huge alliance of different massive pieces of the global financial architecture: banks, institutional investors, asset managers, insurers. And if you add them all up, they have something like $130 trillion under their management. And in the banking sector, it's like 40% of all global banking assets are now signed up to this voluntary UN campaign. So this isn't to say it's perfect. It certainly is not, but it shows there's a lot of interesting scope for that. It's a very active topic. So just a few weeks ago, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed this high-level panel to investigate non-state actor net zero topics, and they're going to report back with their kind of view on who's good, who's bad, and what needs to happen before the next COP at COP27. So again, kind of conscious effort to try to steer this voluntary landscape in a positive direction. But the third component of our governance ecosystem is a little bit less voluntary and a little bit more universal, and it's the international standards setting system. And as some of you have had the pleasure of studying accounting or law or things of that nature, you might be familiar with these kinds of standards because actually they apply to basically every aspect of the world economy, of all the national economies, has some of these kind of standards setting things. Why does this clicker, work like this, not like that? It's a standard that's doing that. So it's this kind of subterranean level of governance, but a really important one. And it's important because it has this ability to bring together huge swaths of the world economy, not just people who are holding their hand up and saying, oh, I'm doing something on climate change, I'm good, look at me, but actually everyone has to be sort of respond to these standards because they become the kind of common frameworks that dictate economic transactions. And they're still voluntary. Someone's like forcing you to sign up to an international organization standard, but they're kind of less voluntary because if you want to do business, you kind of need to speak the language that your interlocutors are speaking, and that happens through the standard setting framework. And importantly, it also mobilizes a much vaster system of kind of monitoring and verification, because if you want to say we are an ISO 14001 company, you have to get third-party auditing to verify that you are. So instead of like an NGO kind of saying you're doing good or doing bad, it's actually kind of like a big global industry, a billions and billions dollar industry that does this, not again perfectly, but has a lot of scope. Also, these international standards have a huge influence on national regulations. Often countries are trying to, are influenced either directly or indirectly by what the kind of international standard is. So a really important step. And what we're seeing really interestingly is this very boring world of international standard setting grappling with net zero in a really direct way for the first time. And that's interesting to me as a scholar of these things, because it signifies a kind of step change in the attention going to it and who's paying attention to why. So in September of last year, the International Organization for Standardization, which goes by the acronym ISO, announced it's going to review all 26,000 of its standards for Paris alignment. And so the standard for, I don't know, what this water bottle looks like, what the kind of level of caffeine in this delicious coffee is, I'm not sure that's the standard, but you know what I mean, is going to be reviewed for compliance with net zero. So we have to now define what that means for cement and for materials and for IT technology and everything else. They've also are developing, in partnership with the UN Race to Zero, a kind of net zero standard for businesses. So this will be not just a voluntary kind of thing that the UN runs, but part of this broader accreditation system. We're also seeing on the financial front a new entity called the International Sustainability Standards Board, part of the kind of international global economic financial governance architecture, looking at how companies should disclose information about climate change. We'll say more about in a second, and people like the OECD are doing this as well. So the kind of global standard setting world is now mobilized as never before. And the fourth part of this ecosystem, which is probably the part that you might be thinking is the solution, the ultimate solution to all of this, is regulation, of course, which, unlike any of the things I mentioned before, is binding. and can compel laggards and can mobilize coercive authority to get people to do things they wouldn't do even under great duress, right? So this is ultimately, what people think maybe we really need to get to, because it'd be surprising if we could kind of convince everyone happily to go along to this big transition, right? There's going to be some laggards, there's going to be some resistance, and we need to find, political scientists, I would say, build political power in a way that ultimately can compel different changes that aren't going to come without that kind of contestation. But of course, regulation has its limits, right? Because it's so powerful, it is often a fiercely contested subject of political influence. And so we're not going to get strong regulation unless we really fight for it. And as the track record shows, strong regulation on climate change is not to be found in many important parts of the world, even including this one. So it can't be guaranteed. And so the question then is, how do you build conditions that lead to better regulatory outcomes? Not to sort of assume this is the solution, we must automatically have it. If we don't have it, oh, we failed. It's like, how do you get there? It's a more interesting question to me. And we're seeing some really interesting developments there. So for example, in the United Kingdom and Spain are in the process of requiring companies to publish net zero transition plans, which would say, answer hopefully the questions that I flagged before about offsetting what scope is covered. Now they'll be required to say what is included or not included as a matter of law. China is developing what it calls a 1+N framework, which is a sector by sector analysis of what needs to happen in steel or in transportation or in agriculture to get to its goal of peaking emissions and then going to carbon neutrality. So that will then translate into company level targets, city level targets, et cetera. And of course, a number of countries are now moving to adopt different kinds of trade measures, the border adjustment mechanisms, these kinds of tools that would put a price on carbon that's traded in products internationally. And again, this is going to require common definitions of what that means and what it means to be aligned. So final point I want to leave us with is, how do we take this heterogeneous, complex governance ecosystem and make it something a bit more fit for purpose? Because that's really what we want to do, and do at speed. And the very unpoetic metaphor I'd like to suggest to you is that of a conveyor belt, which I feel is maybe appropriate for an industrial city like Philadelphia, which is at factories. You can think about this stuff, and so it's rolling off the system here. What does that mean? So bear with me with this complicated image, but it is a complicated ecosystem. So I've given you an idea of 4 different pieces of governance architecture: voluntary initiatives, which you can see here on the right side, orchestration campaigns toward the middle, standards, and then regulations. And I think each of these actually has an important role to play. And if you link them into a system, the strengths of one can help to compensate for the weaknesses of another, and vice versa. So at the frontier best practice, we want to have voluntary initiatives, experimenting, trying to get leaders to move faster, to get going, to try to build up a critical mass of action that can then create outcomes that influence others and hopefully make them act more. That's great. But we also know we have a lot of weak voluntary initiatives at the same time, which are the more greenwashing ones. So that's where hopefully the orchestration campaigns, these UN Race to Zero things, can come in. The high-level panel the Secretary General has set up to try to separate a bit of what's working from what's not working, and to shine the spotlight on what's working. All of that hopefully can then influence what happens in the standard setting realm and in the regulatory realm. And the regulation can be very powerful, but I think without kind of good standards, it's likely to be quite fragmented and quite heterogeneous, where it's not going to be, it's going to reflect the balance of power between kind of pro-climate and anti-climate interest groups in any given jurisdiction. And so if we can get good international standards, that's one more important lever helping to raise the bar globally. So on this side, you have sort of less binding, but maybe more scope for innovation, more scope to kind of create higher standards. On this side of the conveyor belt, you have more binding, but maybe harder to update, less influence or pro-climate voices in a lot of the key places. And so maybe you can build them together into some kind of overarching system that's going to be effective. And arguably, this is now what we see emerging in some way. To me, this is interesting as a scholar of global governance, because it doesn't look really anything like, the UN or the World Trade Organization or the World Bank, or a kind of conventional model for solving global problems through intergovernmental institutions. It's much more complicated, many different actors, and it has this sort of dynamic character, right? We're always pushing ahead the frontier of best practice as we push the emission path down to net zero. So I think, it's really interesting, because climate change, this great global challenge, a fundamentally interdisciplinary one, is actually leading to new political institutions that are redefining a little bit how we think about international cooperation overall, what it really means to set up international institutions. Let me just give you one example where this has worked really well to make it a bit more concrete. And that's in the realm of corporate disclosure requirements. So in the early 2000s, even as late in the late 1990s, companies began to self-report their emissions and other kind of climate-related information, either just voluntarily or through organizations like the Carbon Disclosure Project, which then, like Kentucky Fried Chicken, named itself CDP instead of Climate Disclosure Project. But anyway, it's an important organization. And that's sort of a voluntary thing. And it really grew, powered mostly by investor pressure on companies to get them to say what they're doing. Then after the 2008 financial crisis, there was a real push and interest in creating a bit more systematic view of that. So the G20 and others took up this idea of created a task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which kind of recommended that voluntary system to go bigger and better, a kind of orchestration effort, right? And now we see that really being picked up in both regulation and standards, where in Japan, in the UK, in the EU, companies are being required to disclose climate-related risks and transition risks in their normal financial reporting, just like they do for any kind of reporting to regulators and investors. And it was proposed just 2 weeks ago by the SEC here in the US to follow suit. So this is really happening, right? We're seeing this transition. Disclosure is one piece of the toolkit, but it's an important one, and it's one that's moved pretty quickly. So imagine how this might move forward in other aspects, and I think we get a sense of where we're going. This is my best version to graphically map the state of current affairs, where remember that robust conveyor belt model I showed you 2 slides ago? This is, I think, the slightly more checkered and patchy reality of where we stand. So we've got some voluntary initiatives, we've got some weak ones, some strong ones. Our system for separating the weak from the strong is okay, but it's not great. We've got some efforts there, but more needs to happen. We've got the standards beginning to develop, but they're slow and they're not really there yet. We've got some patchwork of regulations emerging. So there's a lot to focus on going forward. Let me leave you with 4 priorities for how we do this forward. So I think we just need to really embrace this idea we got from really the activists, I think, really, that we have to get beyond blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg put it, and build integrity, because there's no value to this 90% of GDP unless we show it's real. And if we don't show it's real, then it should not be here. We should discard it. And that's the challenge of governance. And we have to do that quickly, because we know effectiveness and speed are the same thing when you're dealing with a climate crisis. Like, there's no version of this where we sit back and say, okay, we'll get these standards right in the next 20 years or so, and then we'll get them rolled out, and it'll be good. It'll be really, really top notch. That's not gonna cut it. So it's really an entirely different scale from how these processes usually work. Entirely different speed. We have to solve the geographic scope question. That is, to my mind, one of the biggest elephants in the room. It hasn't yet been figured out how these different conveyor belt systems are going to really interact with all parts of the world economy, and that's fundamental. And finally, this weird conveyor belt ecosystem is not something that you can go and vote at, or something you can kind of show up and say, hi system, I'd like you to hear my view on this. What's its legitimacy, right? In a federal government or in a state government, you have processes of administrative law and other processes. We're trying to think through how decisions get made and who holds power and how you hold that power accountable. And much harder to do in this very complex system we're building in real time as we speak. So how do we make sure that that part gets part of it as well? So basically, my point is we need to govern net zero, and we're doing it beginning quickly, but not quickly enough. And we're doing it in ways that need to be scaled up. So I'm looking forward to your questions and hoping to work with all of you on that journey as we go forward to net zero. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was fantastic. I'm loaded with questions, but I'm also a very deferential moderator. So let me start with the room and see if anyone would like to get us kicked off. Any non-staff members? No? Okay. I'm going to refer to. Oh. Sorry, all of you out there.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Is this on? I think it's on. So you spoke about subnationals and non-state actors. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the appropriateness of net zero commitments in places like cities, where so much of the action that they need to take kind of redounds outside of their jurisdiction?
Great question. So for cities, there's obviously some things you can control and some things you can't control. But that's true for companies as well. It's true for regions. It's true for countries. And so the difficult part I see is how do we operationalize these commitments in a way that's consistent with what's realistic. Different cities, of course, have different powers, like very different powers. Some have control over many things. Some are just kind of ceremonial offices, right? So it has to be tailored to that. And I think the struggle we've seen in the operationalization piece is that there can't be a common benchmark. It has to be quite specific to different cities. So my view on that is that the kind of every city can have a net zero target. Every city should have a plan, but the plans need to be kind of calibrated to what's possible for its powers and its abilities. I think it's also useful to make clear for any actor, including a city, what can you do? And then what do you need others to do in order to achieve your goal you set? And that's true for a country as well, right? A country may need to work with other countries to be able to have the ability to get to a net zero outcome. And so as long as you're clear on that, that's fine, because then you're creating the conditions under which those your lack of capacity can be identified and solved. What's tricky is when you don't even say anything about that, and then it's hard to know what you can or can't do. So I think the cities have been pretty good actually about articulating, we can go this far ourselves, and then to go further, we need you, governments, or you, private sector, to do X, Y, and Z. So I think that's the best way to approach it.
Nice. Anyone else? Yes, Walter.
Really interesting talk. Thank you. Something I'm a little curious about is, do you think there should be standardization in the pathways to net zero, or is that flexibility ultimately better for individual actors?
It's a great question. So there are many paths you could walk, right? And some will be better for some people, some will be better for others. I mean, if you were a really, really selfish airline, for example, you'd say the best path to net zero is everyone do everything and I'll just do nothing until 2049. And then you'll have solved the problem for me. So obviously that's not going to work, and that's why we need politics. I think actually there's a huge effort to be done in taking the kind of scenarios that people base pathways to net zero on and trying to put a little bit of, not one to rule them all, but kind of some common guardrails around them. So usually we see this in some of the standards as kind of saying they should be low or no overshoot, meaning that they're not prioritizing future removals over immediate reductions, and that they should be consistent with sustainable development goals, which is an important thing, but quite a difficult thing to operationalize. So I would love to see all these different actors, maybe the UN or others, could bring them together to kind of say, okay, let's be a bit more concrete. We can't agree on the one thing, but we could say at least a valid pathway means you're out of coal by this time frame. Like a really low-hanging fruit like that could be shaved off. And I think that'd be a very productive conversation.
I've got one interesting question, actually two, from the global audience. So let me, I can hold it up to, and then Pete, yeah. So let me invite one question from the world. First being that, with all the kind of the fragmentation in your actual conveyor belt and all the multiplicity of action, so it seems like there's kind of a pending governance moment here about parallel, possibly competing kind of products coming down the line, right? Ultimately, perhaps a set of standards or something. And have you thought about that moment, right? About how we kind of shake out maybe some contending conveyor belts in effect, the way that might actually kind of fill itself out around the world?
Absolutely. So I think this is really, about to hit the fan, as they say, in the trade space, where different big buying markets, EU most prominently, but also EU and the US working together on steel and aluminum, are beginning to think about how they might condition imports on different kinds of carbon goals. And that's tied to some kind of net zero pathway that they're either explicitly or implicitly imposing on themselves and then on their trading partners. And so countries like China and India and Russia prominently are not very pleased with that, because they'd like to be the ones to define what that should mean. And probably they're not going to agree perfectly on what that is, and there are probably a lot of strategic geopolitical incentives not to agree on those things. And so it's going to be a lot of conflict on different models. That's where I think your question on how we can kind of align a little bit on the pathways would help, because even if you're not going to solve geopolitical competition and trade by getting a common view of what the scenario should be, you could begin to shave some of the wider tails of the distribution off, right? And I think that'd be a productive kind of low level kind of technical cooperation project to develop further.
Is your analytic intuition on this that it would be better to anticipate that moment and try to build legitimacy in advance of any obvious winners, or is that just not feasible? Do we have to get farther down the substantive progress?
My view on that is it should be any kind of trade club for climate should have two kind of features. One, it should be high quality and based on some kind of scientific output. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to see it as anything more than a sort of hard-knuckled trade thing, which is also the thing we observe in the world and will continue to do. But I think that's one step. But then it should be open. So if you can come up to that standard that we've collectively defined, it should be open for everyone, right? And if it's not, then maybe it's doing some other kind of work, geopolitically or otherwise. But kind of a set of high but open club standards would be, to my mind, the kind of optimal one. And then critically, not just having it be a wall. Because we have a lot of decarbonizing fortresses and some islands around the world. We're not going to help with trade overall, and we're not going to achieve what we don't achieve on climate. So it has to come with some kind of pathway to help those parts of the world that are looking to get involved in the green value chain to do so, particularly developing countries that are looking to industrialize. So I see a package like that as being very promising. And if you wanted to put a geopolitical lens on it, what better way for a country like the United States or Europe or China, who is trying to compete with some of the other large trading powers to build kind of its coalition, than to begin to expand that value chain to smaller countries that would like to kind of bandwagon together with. So I think it's a pretty raw political interest in doing that.
Yeah. Just one more follow up on this line, and it's Pete. Is Pete in the queue that you're pointing? Next, I promise. Do you think who knows what's the idea? What's the word globalization? But do you think that the form that globalization has emerged in is an accelerator or an obstacle or a platform for the kinds of world you're envisioning on governing net zero?
I don't know, but I think we're possibly, this is speculation, at the phase where it was beneficial and now is becoming an obstacle. It was beneficial by helping create value chains that scaled up renewable energy and other kinds of technologies very quickly. So there's a scholar at SAIS, Jonas Nam, has written a great book about how different kinds of companies have been able to collaborate with each other in Germany and China and the US on solar, on wind, and other kinds of things. And so leveraging all the benefits of economic exchange to develop new technologies and to deploy them at scale. If you, though, add a little bit of a more political lens on it, you might think, okay, that's good to get things going, but then what if you get a backlash against that? Because people want jobs and they want those jobs to be their jobs and they want to own that value chain. And so maybe something that's actually more sustainable with long term is a little bit less efficient at the beginning, but has a bit more kind of strong constituencies for it that sustain it over decades to come. I think we're possibly kind of at a transition point in that story where what we've worked in the past may not be what we need to have going forward.
It's really interesting. Great. Pete.
Tom, thanks. Great talk. Thinking about where all the private capital is going today, almost entirely into removal technologies, and then likewise in carbon accounting, but next to nothing in monitoring, reporting and verification, likewise, environmental and societal impacts. Do you see a role in government to kind of support these less attractive investment opportunities? And then what role do you see in for the government in oversight on like a Vera carbon standard, right? So these largely and potentially flawed, particularly in light of the recent criticism of overcrediting. And yeah, thanks.
Great question. So on the first one, I think it's exactly right. There's a huge need just to do basic monitoring of who's doing what. So this like Net Zero Tracker, which is an academic project powered by lots of student volunteers who are just interested in it and kind of want to learn about it. That's actually providing a pretty important public good that I happen to know big companies are now using to like do stuff on. And there's this massive kind of ESG investing kind of space, which is growing very quickly and not particularly maybe robustly, I would say. There's obviously a market need there, but you're absolutely right that there's like a bit of a incentive misalignment, I think, because if you're a large financial data provider, do you really have an incentive to like get it right on the climate science, or do you kind of have an incentive to create something that's going to be an easy product to sell? I think that's a bit of the gap we're seeing. Where I'm encouraged, and I think this would be a great space for more investment, would be on some of the satellite imaging, some of the remote sensing work that's going to actually fundamentally change how we monitor things in real time. That's a hugely growing space, and one where I think it'd be great to see a company come forward. Just a small anecdote. Google told me in 2013 they were going to provide real-time data on cities' carbon emissions, like for all the big cities in the world, like that year. And I'm still waiting for that. This is Google, right? So there's some kind of market failure there. And then on the point on oversight, exactly, like this is where governance is really needed. And we have a big, to my mind, again, the model is like financial accounting. It's a massive industry. It's a regulatory imperative, and it's needed, but it's also quite flawed, right? It's not like there are Enrons in the world, and like that will be times 10 with carbon, I think, because it's all growing very quickly. So yeah, we need it, but we shouldn't like have any kind of illusions that it's going to be 100% panacea.
Another question from the world has to do, and there were a couple kind of in this spirit, and it's kind of net zero adjacent, but it's really also, I think, kind of prior politically and logically in some way. So you probably have to deal with this question a lot, which is, what kind of mechanisms do we need to sequence some of the actions, in particular, making sure that, and what mechanisms what form might those mechanisms take if we do need them, to make sure that we're getting the reductions that we can at some breakpoint, at least, or something like that, out of the system before they need to be removed.
So I think all good net zero standards have this sort of mitigation hierarchy idea where you have to prioritize emissions reductions, especially in the short term, and not sort of leave that for later. And we've seen that being picked up even in courts. So you might have heard about this case where Shell was sued in Dutch courts by an NGO, and the court found that actually Shell's net zero target was in error because it had backloaded too many of the emissions reductions. It hadn't front loaded enough, and that was, in the court's view, not appropriate. So yeah, this is, I think, a common principle, and again, it's about operationalizing it into reality. And one issue I think does it quite bluntly but kind of compellingly is when I had a picture of on the screen the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, which is one of these like smaller but quite leading private standard setters. Their rule is 7% a year. If you're not reducing emissions 7% every year, you're out. And that's pretty blunt. It doesn't have any sectoral differentiation. You might be challenged to, as a, I don't know, aviation company to join that kind of thing, but it has a, that's basically what we need to achieve on average. And that's pretty clear.
That's good. Great. Terrific. Did I hear oh, yes.
Hi, so you mentioned that a key step for the future is creating integrity through establishing effectiveness. Is this something that will be achieved through trial and error, or are there any surefire practices that that actors can implement now?
I'm sure it'll involve a lot of trial and error, but there's a lot of many of it's not rocket science, right? So we have of those 2,000 companies that we were looking at, I think 679, I can't quite remember, have a net zero target. So what about the other 1,400, right? So if you're, there's a lot more to figure out as we kind of advance this frontier of best practice, and that's going to involve experimentation and trial and error. There's already a lot to be done with the ones who aren't yet on that train. So I think if you're really serious about it, you should be in the realm of trial and error, because there's a lot of uncertainties we don't know, and that's exactly why we need leadership. But if you're not on that frontier, then yeah, as I think they used to say in the 1920s, hop on the trolley.
I got a question that's very specific and also about a recent standard. Mike, turn it off so that my private conversations with Angela aren't broadcast around the world. The SEC disclosure project standard, are you familiar with that one? The questioner asks how you think it compares with some of the ones you have discussed, the European ones and so on.
I think it's quite good. There's, critically it includes scope 3 is these indirect emissions. If they're material, which is the same language you find, for example, in Science-Based Targets Initiative, I'd love them to be a bit more precise about what they mean by material, because that's potentially quite a, could be very vague. But I think that will be resolved positively and as it gets implemented. So I'm sort of, needs to be watched, but I'm encouraged by where it's going. We have, the EU ones are beginning now for kind of a pilot program, and then they'll kick in for everyone in 2024. The UK one is already operational, but it's only just started. So I think we're really learning what it means at scale. The early versions of the voluntary TCFD, Task Force on Climate Disclosure of Climate-Related Risks, they're pretty mixed, I would say. Some companies basically said, here's our sustainability report, like no more information than you would get in a kind of brochure. In terms of, if you think about the ecosystem level, again, I think this is one where activists, NGOs should not just be saying, show us your net zero target, but like, let's read the details, and we need to kind of scale up the capacity to really dig into those details.
Is there kind of emerging evidence in the ecosystem framework that, when an actor that kind of might be characterized as late in the conveyance, like the SEC, right, that there actually are kind of observable kinds of connections from the earlier actions, some of the voluntary learning or the innovation or other things that, is the research agenda so far along that you're able to kind of really call out some of the supporting evidence?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's not like regulators are somehow separate from these conversations. They've been part of it really from the get-go, or at least sort of aware of it. And so it's probably not so much like maybe the conveyor belt metaphor is a little bit misleading here, because it's really kind of a co-development model in some ways. So the science-based target standards have this material, scope 3 requirement, and that's kind of exactly the language we see in many of the disclosure requirements. So it's could be it's just people get to the same place because they think about the problem and they go work through it like calculus and get to the answer, or is it because they're influencing each other? I think it's a lot of mutual discussion. It's not a vast world of people, right? There's an epistemic community of experts who think about this. So all of these networks help.
Yeah, interesting. Good. From the floor, anyone? Angela.
Thank you, Tom. This was a very interesting talk, and understanding how it can be governing, which seems to be very, very complicated. But I wonder, since a big role on this getting to net zero is offsets right now, I mean, what are your views on offset markets? Because right now we have seen all these corporations running to get, cheap offsets around the world. And what is left for, the poor countries, and also what is left for, there are always so many need to offset. But at this point, you cannot talk about cannibalizing that market, but that may come if everyone continues just offsetting and not reducing. Yeah. So what are your views?
Great question. So two things. Indeed, the offset market we've seen to date has a very wide range of outcomes, some good things, a lot of not good things, and there's no ability really for consumers or people who are just trying to know what's going on to really distinguish what's what. It's voluntary standards, some of which I think are better than others, but no one's like going around and saying, hey, corporation, you bought this many of this kind, we don't like this kind, you should have bought that kind. Like that kind of detail is not happening, as I showed in that slide. Many aren't even disclosing what they're doing in the offsetting realm, so it's really hard to kind of hold that accountability there. I think it needs regulation. I think we should have like really high standards for what an offset should be. There's various groups working on developing that in the kind of orchestration space, something called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, also one that used to be called the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, and now has a slightly different title. So there's a lot of action in that space, but ultimately I think it's important to remember the second point, which is we need to prioritize what we actually want to achieve. Like that emissions curve is the top priority, and offsets can be an important but probably pretty small piece of that. The voluntary market is something like, I don't know, 2 billion per year or something. It's like, it's not a big chunk of what we actually need to do. And I worry that we see a lot of emphasis both by kind of the greenwashers and by the people trying to hold the greenwashers to account on this one particular tool and not on the bigger prize. And I think that's a little bit of a misallocation of priorities. So we should definitely call out the bad offsetting. We should definitely build up like some robust systems that can channel resources to solutions we need. But you know, as you were saying, if we're not reducing immediately, like that's by far the most important thing. So we should really put the emphasis there.
It's kind of a follow-up to that is some of our clean energy lab partners and colleagues from across the street and inside this building as well on some days of the week have kind of helped us understand some of the differences between the nature-based and the technology-based removals, which are often, often part of what they do is serve as the currency of offsets. Is there any either kind of analytic leverage or maybe some design leverage that comes from the differences between those sources of sinks at the ecosystem level?
Yeah, so in Oxford, we've tried to think a little bit about that. We have something called, rather grandiosely, the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting, which is trying to kind of map out some high level criteria that you would want from an offsetting system in a net zero world. So obviously, if you're getting to the level of residual emissions to have net zero, you need to make sure that every ton you might be putting in is getting permanently neutralized in a way that's like for like. So the time scale of any greenhouse gases are similar and really neutralizing them. And we don't have, and so if you're digging fossil carbon out of the ground and putting it into the atmosphere and then planting a tree that may not be permanent, then you're not really doing like for like, right? Because it's you have to discount that sink by some sort of deterioration rate or whatever. So in that sense, the technological solutions are probably I think surely going to become more and more significant as you get to the level of residual emissions, because we can be much more confident that that's a permanent solution. At the same time, though, we know we're not going to have a net zero world unless we restore and preserve all of the nature that we need, because there's no way that it's all going to balance out unless the natural sinks are working as they have historically and must in the future. So channeling resources into that, especially in the short term, like in this decade, probably one of the most important things to do to crush the emissions curve is to stop cutting down so many forests. Like that's an urgent priority. And so if we can mobilize some contributions to do that, that's going to help the overall outcome we get to. What I think we get a bit confused is like, if companies are investing in these nature-based solutions, but not also doing the reductions, then we're not making progress. So if we can just kind of separate those two things, we're going to be in better state, but we need both.
Right. Any other, Pete, follow up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of follow up on that, the nature. So going back to Vera recently, as you may or may not have seen, is embracing this idea of ton year accounting. So moving away from credits on a ton basis, which are historically kind of assigned over 100-year permanence as sort of a minimum, to now annually assigning tons, right? And then kind of re-upping. There's a lot of hesitation. There's a lot of potential criticism and moral hazard here. I think what one opponent says that suddenly now fires aren't a risk anymore. But does this de-emphasize what we really need, which is kind of that kind of permanent? You talk about the 5 qualities of quality removal. I think that's opposite of many of the virtues: do no harm, durability, etc. So. What's the risk here?
Yeah, no, I think in general, like accounting is just not a great way to deal with land use changes. Like the problem with preserving forests is not a problem of accounting; it's a problem of empowering people in rural Indonesia or in the Amazon to have alternative livelihoods, and like that's where emphasis should go. And so we can create a complicated accounting system that kind of tries to figure out a way to monetize some of that problem to mobilize resources for it. But to me, that seems like a little bit of a sideshow, right, to the main effort. So I don't have a kind of concrete view on various efforts per se, but I think, yeah, we need to get the accounting right, but that's not the problem to solve. Like, the problem to solve is how do we build better state capacity in rural Indonesia? Like, that's the issue, and that's not going to be solved by accounting. So I think we need to kind of be very skeptical, as you're saying, of kind of what paper fixes that seem to, probably a little bit optimistic about the real challenges we face.
Do we have any other questions from the floor? Come on, we're getting close to that last call. You got one? All right, let me ask one, and then I'll come over and memorize the one you picked over there. Do we have the right, let's straw man cop. Do we have the right kind of tentative platform for governing some of these larger ecosystem questions, or is that so existing agenda laden, that particular example, that it's better to start something new? This feels like it needs that forum, right? That venue, because there's so you raise, and I'm sure you've only had time to share the tip of your iceberg, right? There's so many things that demand attention span from limited attention span actors, over the foreseeable future. What's your existing, okay, I'll accept it, and what's your dream platform for that?
So there's a great cartoon that I often use, which is two people talking like, oh, there's 14 different standards for this. How are we going to make sense of this all? I know what we need to know. We need a new standard that's going to put them all together. Outcome, now there are 15 standards that we have, right? And that's kind of what we've been doing over this process. So can we imagine kind of a better governance structure to bring them together? I think we can imagine it, but I wouldn't want us to look at success as requiring kind of like, as Parliament of Nations to agree on what the pathway should be. It's going to be messier than that, is messier than that. And therefore, we need to design a more complex system. And maybe there's a silver lining here. Maybe as we face more complex challenges, diseases, for example, or things, we can improve our technologies of governance to be a little bit more agile, a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more inclusive. And, international organizations, as we know them, didn't exist 200 years ago. Right? We built them up because we had globalization, we had problems we had to manage across borders. So too with these kinds of problems, maybe we'll see shifts in how political institutions look. And we shouldn't expect them to look perfect at the start, but as we learn, I hope we can build up an ecosystem that achieves all we need to achieve.
That is one of my favorite pieces of voice, and so I never get any feedback clue. I think this is one of my favorite, as an audience member, as a student of pieces of political science wisdom, which is, the steady, consistent advice for the rest of us to not fall for this illusion of organizational determining perfect solution, prior condition necessary before action can be taken. Because the Gen Pop that I'm part of on this scholarship is just kind of assumes that there is one, right? And that you guys know what it is, and that if we listen to you carefully enough, right, we'll learn. But it's clear that the real wisdom here is that you're not gonna last if you wait for that condition, right? And that you're much more likely to kind of discover a workable venue, right, by taking the step-by-step actions that you've started to kind of outline. So terrific. Good. All right, this is the last call for questions from the floor. No? Well, thank you very much, Tom. Great presentation, but also fantastic conversation here. Thank you. And because this is our last event of the year, I don't have to remember to tell you to be sure to attend our next event. So our next event will be in September. I have no idea what it's going to be, but as soon as we find out, we'll let you know. Thank you.